Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me? Hello, everybody. If you could take a seat, we're going to get going. Secretary Monfort has a tight window, so we're going to try to accommodate it as best we can. Good afternoon, and welcome to all of you for joining us here in person and all of the colleagues and friends who are joining us online as we're live streaming. My name is Jonathan Spalter. I am the CEO of USTelecom, and I'm really delighted that we can convene today. I'd like to start with a very special welcome in particular for the USTelecom Board of Directors and Leadership Committee, who have just arrived in the last 24 hours here in Washington for a series of meetings that we're having at our new headquarters just a couple of blocks up the street. So please welcome to our Board and Leadership Committee at USTelecom. Thank you very much for joining. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, I just wanted to say a couple of high-level words about why we at USTelecom are continuing to sponsor this important gathering, the 10th Cybersecurity Policy Forum here in Washington, D.C. We all know quite clearly that the world's economy has evolved to the point where our collective national and economic and even political security in many respects depends entirely on our ability to secure the digital infrastructure that really does bind us and it all together. And this message was very crystal clear in the May 11th, 2017 executive order strengthening the cybersecurity of federal networks and critical infrastructure, and the more recent January 5th report to the President, which really did outline a very specific vision that we must act with greater urgency and collective engagement to combat the cyber threats that are present and clear. The regular attacks and vulnerabilities in cyberspace do make it abundantly clear that time, unfortunately, really is not on our side. There is a need for urgency, and it is not hyperbole nor a surprise to read in the December 2017 NSTAC report, and I know that's all fresh on everybody's minds, a very clear and bold call for a moonshot approach to address this modern 21st century scourge. Now is the time in this digital age to embrace our shared responsibility to forge partnerships between government and industry across all sectors and around the globe to stay ahead of our cyber adversaries who are getting smarter and more wily by the moment. And we at USTelecom take this responsibility dead seriously. We're committed to working not in silos, but across our innovation sectors on this common purpose and as allies. The broadband providers, the IT sector, software, internet, cloud, networking, and other enterprises that comprise the global ICT community are and will be working more cohesively and in a more coordinated fashion in the days ahead. As industry and as innovators, we can lead, we must lead, and we will lead. And I want you all to stay tuned because we will have much more concrete announcements about how we intend to do so operationally and are underway in doing so in the coming weeks. Meantime, we're very fortunate to have tremendous leadership and talent, not just in industry, but also and particularly in government here in Washington, who really do understand the existential nature of the threats that we are facing digitally, and are committed to ensuring our national and economic security and our very quality of life is preserved, sustained, and enhanced because of their efforts. And today we're going to hear from industry officials, including, I'd like to just point out, one of our members of USTelecom from AT&T, as well as representatives from two leading cabinet agencies, the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Commerce. I'm also very delighted that all of us are going to also hear from my colleague, our new Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity, Robert Mayer, who will be leading the panel after our keynote speech. All of them are going to share insights and perspectives on the Cybersecurity State of the Union, and I'm looking forward to hearing their views. But first, I'm really delighted to introduce one of those leaders, one of our national leaders in cybersecurity, as our keynote speaker, Jeanette Momfra. Jeanette. She has a very long bio, and I've tried hard to condense it into a few words, but we all know that she serves as the National Protectorate and Programs Director, Assistant Secretary for the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications at the Department of Homeland Security. She's the Chief Cybersecurity Official at DHS and leads an organization. It is an exciting organization whose mission it is to enhance the security, the resilience, and the reliability of our nation's cyber and our communications infrastructure and assets. At the White House, at the Department of Homeland Security, and across the nation, Secretary Momfra continues to be both a strong voice for accountability, both from the federal government and from we in the civilian critical infrastructure community. And I'm really honored and delighted to welcome our keynote speaker, Secretary Jeanette Momfra.
Thank you all. And it's so nice to see all the familiar faces. I feel like there's like a group of us that just all sort of like travel around and share ideas. And so it's always nice to be able to kind of address a group of you. And I wanted to, it's the first time I get to talk in 2018, so it's a great opportunity to sort of talk about some of the progress we've made on things, and then where we want to go for the rest of this year and how we're setting things up for the rest of the administration. Before I actually talk about cybersecurity, though, I wanted to talk about the communications part of my title, which I actually don't get to talk about very much. And what a lot of people, I think, don't know is that in addition to the cybersecurity work, my organization is also responsible for working with industry to restore and recover communications infrastructure in the event of a disaster, as well as public safety, interoperability, and operability, and working with the FirstNet group to get that up and running. And so we have deep and long partnerships with the communications industry, probably one of our longest and most enduring partnerships. And I didn't want to sort of talk to this group without acknowledging that tremendous partnership, but also just the amazing work that was done to assist in the recovery and response through the various different hurricanes, as well as the wildfires. So I just like to, before we get into sort of everything going on with cybersecurity, I feel that it's really important to just say how much we and the country depends upon the really just tremendous work that the communications company do to help us. And I think one of the key things that we've learned from that in those response and recovery efforts is that communications is now every bit as important as energy. And it's not just because of the dependence that people have on it, but it's also the ability to use our communications infrastructure for things like search and rescue and in identifying people and next generation 911. And there's so much that as we deploy broadband and kind of merge and converge our IT and communications infrastructure, there's so much capability and I think promise, and we need to ensure, of course, that we're maintaining the security of us. So that will be my segue into the security side of it. So, as I kind of mentioned, I really believe this is a really exciting time to be in the cybersecurity and communications mission. I've been at the department for a little over 10 years. Actually, it started with standing up the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications, and now I have the honor of leading it, which is honestly one of the coolest things. If you've never been able to do that, it's such a cool opportunity, and to be able to be a part of an organization when it's just sort of starting out, everybody wondering what it is that you're supposed to be doing, and what your role is, and evolving to where we are now, where I believe that we are having in partnership with all of you in this room and others that are viewing online and those that couldn't participate, to creating that safer, stronger cyber ecosystem. That digital world that Jonathan talked about, again, it has so much promise for our country. It has given our country such great economic development and social interaction, and there's so much there. And I believe that is what we're working to preserve. And it's always helpful, I believe, to sort of keep your eyes on that prize. We're not in the security business for the purposes of security, but we're in the business of doing this so that we can keep that infrastructure and those networks and the internet safe and secure for the next generation. So that being said, I want to talk about kind of, well, how did we get here? And I talk about this a lot. I'm a defender. I come from Wisconsin, so maybe it was always in my genes to have to become a defender, but we know that defense wins championships, just not this last year. But generally speaking, defense does win championships. And so how did we get to the space where we're at right now? The defender is not winning the championship right now. And I think a lot of it goes back to how the internet and networks were originally developed. It was for innovation and automation, and which means efficiency and cost savings. But this can be at the cost of security, which is often an afterthought or bolted on aftermarket. And it also sometimes comes into conflict with other objectives that individuals have who may be using these systems. Security is not easy. Security doesn't always fit into what a CIO, for example, is being held account to. So how do we make these things work together? And I truly, like I said, I believe that the defending cyberspace is not impossible. I don't think it's a fool's errand. It's not always the sexiest side of the equation, but I really do believe that we can change the game. And I believe that while attackers only have to be right once, we can, as a community, and I believe with our leadership, and I like the word that you use, accountability, the federal government being accountable, private sector being accountable, working across internationally to create a cyber environment where in such threats, say an email or specific piece of malware, it can only be used once. And that it's not something that's easy to spread. It's not something that can affect multiple victims who happen to just randomly stroll onto the same watering hole that was a target for somebody else. So we talked a little bit previously in previous op-eds and others about the concept of collective defense. And I think that is really what best captures what it is that we're trying to get to. It's not this notion, sort of the international treaties, that's not exactly what I'm referring to, but the concept of collective defense. It's more than information sharing. Information sharing is a critical part of it and something that we're continuing to strive at to get better. And how do we help our resources in the government, largely within the intelligence community, understand what it is that would be useful for network defenders in whether it's civilian government in the United States or in critical infrastructure? How do we help them better use their resources? And DHS has a role in that, working with you all. And then on the flip side, as our intelligence community and law enforcement and other capabilities that the government has available to it identifies information that would be useful, how do we ensure that gets out quickly? And we have a lot of ways to get it out. We can automate that, and we want to continue to automate as much as possible. But we can also have the capability to have these classified briefings, knowing we're never going to classify our way out of this problem, but to have that capability where we can have those trusted relationships. And I am committed to continuing to improve our ability to provide classified briefings and the clearances necessary to do that. I know that has been a challenge, and that is one of our priorities, is to improve that, because I understand that there are just some things that we are not going to be able to be declassified. That being said, we're also trying to lean further forward in the products that we push out. We've put out multiple products we refer to as Hidden Cobra. And those are products related to where we are identifying North Korean use of infrastructure domestically in the United States, and we're asking people to look at that and take that infrastructure down. I encourage you to take those products. These are much more forward-leaning than we have been in the past. They take a little bit longer to get out, but these are the types of actions where we're looking at what are the things, again, going back to this collective defense model, what are the capabilities that the government has, which is largely in the area of understanding, information collection, and broad understanding of risk, that we can help industry take actions. But what actions can industry take to reduce the overall risk of threat actors using, in this case, infrastructure that is repeatedly used? So those are sort of some of the examples. I wanted to walk through some of the specific programs. We've talked a lot about automated indicator sharing in the past, and I'm really proud of this program. But I will go through some of the honest feedback that we've received and what we're doing about it. What I'm proud of the program is we were able to stand a pretty complicated capability up really quickly. And I'm also proud of the fact that we had enough strong partnerships that we could say, look, I need your honest feedback. We're going to deploy something fairly quickly. And for those of you who are in the business of putting products out, you know how the process can be complicated. And but we wanted to be open. We wanted to say, look, our goal, we need to get this capability out, but we want people to test it. We want people to be a part of it. Tell us what works, what doesn't work. And so I think on both of those, it's something that I'm really proud of. So I'll tell you the feedback. Well, we've got, I think, what do I have here? More than 200 organizations now we've got signed up. A lot of people signing up to receive the indicators, which is great. But some of the feedback in conversations that we have with people is that there's a sort of a couple different flavors. Some folks will say, you know, these aren't very useful to me. I've already got a pretty sophisticated capability. And say, well, you know what? It's not actually intended for you to be in receive mode. If you're a sophisticated entity that has a lot of understanding of what's going on, either you run large networks or you're providing services, you need to be providing that information to us so we can then be pushing that out broadly. So we're protecting the broader supply chain. Because this is about raising the entire ecosystem up to a higher level of automated defense. This is about not having humans having to worry about the same indicators over and over and over again. So this isn't about the most exquisite technical sort of information you have and you're nervous about who to share it with. This is about sharing within the broad community and trying to remove those whatever number you want to pick, 80, 90% of noise. And allow those SOCs and those analysts to focus on the more complicated, more sophisticated threat actors that they have to deal with. The other piece that we ask people a lot is, are you automated? Are you actually automating the actions that you're taking, not just automating the ingest? And anecdotally, most people will say, no, we're not. And a lot of that is because, I don't have to go into too much detail for folks here, but generally it's, we don't have enough context. And so we wouldn't want to, sort of automate all the way to a block action and have it be, something that wasn't necessarily relevant for our organization. And that was actually really useful feedback for us. And we had a lot of really in-depth conversations with companies. And so we're going to, in a combination with the process of updating Styx Taxi up to 2.1, which will allow for more of that technical context, such as the age of indicators, et cetera. We're going to be modernizing our AAS as well. So a couple of things that we'll be putting out more guidance on this in the near future, but looking at how can we ensure that we have that right context in there to enable the automation? Because if you're not automating the whole sort of process, it's not really getting us to that next level of an automated defense. So we'll be looking at things, like I said, like context. We're also looking for feedback. Right now, there's not necessarily a capability to automate the feedback back to the department. And that's actually very important for us to understand. What are you actually doing with this information? So there'll be some capability in the updated version, which will be late summer, early fall-ish, that we'll be pushing this out, that we would encourage all of industry to enable as well, because the more, what we call the sightings, the more understanding that we get for what people are doing with that information, the more that we can understand differentiating these different indicators and trying to do some more analysis on who's doing what. So that's where we're going on AAS. We are, but again, remember, this is about volume and velocity. This is the sort of the much more in-depth conversations that we want to have. That is not AIS. And I know I've said it a few times now, but we seem to continue to need to clarify that. What we do want to do in addition to that is through our Cybersecurity Information Sharing Collaboration Program, which is CISP, that many of your companies have signed agreements with us, is really think about the collaboration side of it. What does it mean to have our analysts sitting and talking to each other? One of the things that we did in WannaCry, which I've talked a lot about, but is where we shared draft products with companies. We had a tremendous amount of participation from the IT and comms folks, and we want to encourage other sectors as well, but saying, okay, we got this malware, we've picked it apart, this is what we're seeing, what do you see? Share that and have that collaboration. We've got the framework to have it, but we want to continue to push. And so a lot of that is on us. And so we're building that capability to have more of those analysts available to industry. And because industry, frankly, they're all sort of just say, when and where do you want us, and we'll show up. And so that's a large priority for us, is building that analytic capability, being much more open and willing to share draft products, which is not always easy to do. But we recognize the value. We just had tremendous value in doing that. And again, having much more regular, in-depth conversations, whether it's at the classified level or at the unclassified level, where we can talk supply chain, where we can talk about these long-term, either potentially catastrophic or systemic risks, and what can we do as a community to reduce that. So that's really been our theme for the last couple months. It's definitely our theme for 2018 is characterizing risk at the federal government, thinking about the federal government as an enterprise. How do we characterize that risk? How do we reduce that risk? And then how do we do that with critical infrastructure? And how do we think about national systemic and catastrophic risk? And how do we get, in particular, I'm very focused on the ICT community as enablers to reduce this risk, either on the preparedness side or the response and the recovery. So we'll be, again, I know you all have been eager and willing to be partners, and we are equally committed to making progress on this, what I will not suggest is an easy activity, but I believe this is really where we need to go, and that the government needs to step up and take leadership on this topic.
That's terrific speech, thank you. Well, why don't we just start off by talking about Badger football? Who's going to replace Troy Fumagalli as tight end next year? Thank you very much. We really appreciate your vision and also the hard work. You laid out a number of important strategies for where we need to go collectively, but also in terms of your department in addressing this ascendant threat. But we all know at the end of the day, it's not just about strategy, it's about execution. And as somebody, as you mentioned, was present at the creation of your department, Cybersecurity and Communications, and you've seen its growth, how do you think, what are going to be some of your critical path priorities in 2018? And how has the department been evolving in terms of its technology domains and people and processes to execute as effectively as you require or need it to?
I could spend all day talking about that. So I think one of my highest priorities is actually internal. So evolving an organization from just 10 years ago was just a couple of hundred people to one that is now over 1,000 people managing $1 billion budget. That's a large transition. So actually a lot of what I'm focused on is internal. How do you mature an organization? I hope you all see the benefits. I don't want to bore you with all the details of things like our internal processes, but I do believe that us building that capability and that maturity internal will allow us to be a better service provider to our customers and partner to our stakeholders. The other priorities is that we're thinking about is a lot around data and what we do as to analyze that data. We see the uniqueness of where DHS sits is at this brilliant sort of nexus of data and partnerships. We have on the federal side, we have a lot of sensors deployed that are increasingly, whether that's through the National Cyber Protection System or continuous diagnostics and mitigation, is really increasing our knowledge of who's got what's actually happening on what. and gives us a tremendous amount of data that's not just useful to the federal government. And we've also got a lot of capability that's developed in, just in the marketplace. People have sort of all over the place. They've deployed sensors. They have sort of big data analytics capability that's going on. They're thinking about kind of next generation technologies, machine learning, AI, to address some of these cybersecurity challenges. And so we're investing a lot in what I would say previously we were focused on the data collection side of it. And so now it's got to be about investing in the analytic capability, because that's where our value is turning that data into information that is useful for people to make risk-based decisions, whether that's sort of very tactical and quick in response to an incident, or it's a larger picture in understanding sort of big picture risk and the different levers, whether it's government or industry, that has to reduce that risk. So a lot of focus on building that analytics, and then the last piece is the risk. Is our new secretary has talked about this. This is something that we've talked about for a while with regards to critical infrastructure. Is what does the risk actually look like? What does a risk profile look like for an agency, for an entity? How can we understand better what national, whether that's systemic or kind of potentially catastrophic, and that's not something that the department can just sort of sit in on its own and figure that out. We need to have that understanding across industry, and I think we've made progress, but that's going to be really our top priority, because what that practically means is how I prioritize my resources. I can't go out and give every single entity in this country an assessment, as much as we'd love to. So how do we prioritize our limited resources? I believe it has to be where it's demonstrably able to reduce risk in some way. And that doesn't mean it's sort of just this means I'm going to go do a pen test over here. It could be cyber insurance, which is a way of having a broad sort of risk impact. But it's thinking about where do we have leverage, where do we have the ability to make an impact, whether that's sort of helping the market or whether it's taking actions in the federal government. And then I would just lastly say, federal cybersecurity is our sort of always our I don't want to say number one mission, but it is the bulk of the work that we have to do, and there's a tremendous amount of work in modernizing what we do, both IT and not just the systems. I say this all the time. It's not just the infrastructure that we're modernizing. We want to modernize everything from governance to how we think about architecture to how we think about procurement, because we don't believe you're going to solve our security problem until we take on the actual IT problem.
You mentioned, and I know we only have 2 or 3 minutes to meet your time frame. You said that part of your vision is that both data and partnerships are the two sides of your departmental coin. Let's talk about partnerships for just a second, because we in the IT and the communications sectors have been meaningfully and seriously taking up the challenge of forging deep partnerships with colleagues in government. From your perspective, what have we in industry been doing well, and what could we improve upon in terms of giving life and meaning and excellence to those partnerships as we're looking at 2018?
For me, it's sort of taking that kind of the risk-based approach. Is there's a lot of things that people would love to solve in cybersecurity. We can't solve them all. So how is industry and DHS and the broader government, I would say, with my commerce partners here being a part of this, is how do we kind of align on priorities? I think that we need to sort of think about sort of same concept. If we can characterize the risk and we can understand the different levers that we may have kind of jointly to reduce that risk, to get to that kind of collective defense, I think we have to have joint priorities that say this is what we're going to tackle. We're not going to solve everything. We know that we're not going to solve everything, but this is what we're going to tackle, and we're going to stay focused on these things. That's not to say bad or good, but I think that both of us need to kind of have that focus. and look for things that will have that broadest impact, that when we decide to tackle those. And that, again, that's something that we have to work through together. But I really, that's sort of, I guess, what I would like to see. And I know we've talked a lot about this already in our different groups. I'm a big fan of the ICT enablers concept. And, I really believe that having that community together that can really assist the government in mitigating the consequences of significant incidents, knowing that we never quite know if it's significant when we first find out about it, but having that community that's together that can take actions on different parts of the internet infrastructure to sort of mitigate something that could be potentially bad. I really believe that that's something that we need to focus on. And I know industry's already working on thinking about that, but we're sort of, that's a big priority for myself.
Before we move to Robert Mayer and our panel, I just want to spend a moment to express our appreciation on behalf of USTelecom for your time today, for your colleagues' times today, your service, and our continued partnership. So, Assistant Secretary Jeanette Monfort, thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Hi, I'm Robert Mayer. I'm Senior Vice President for Cybersecurity with USTelecom. I want to make a few quick remarks to recognize some of the folks in the audience. First of all, I want to thank USTelecom CEO Jonathan Spalter, who arrived at USTelecom a year ago with a real vision of how technology fits into our industry, and importantly, the role of cybersecurity. And how it was going to become increasingly more important for our society, and he has been extraordinarily supportive of the efforts of the USTelecom staff to pursue this area. I also want to thank the members of the board and the leadership committee who are here, who've been equally supportive. We've recently formed a small medium business cybersecurity committee, information sharing to bring the kind of information that Jeanette was talking about to our broader membership throughout the United States. Obviously, I want to thank all the folks in the room here, many of whom we've worked with often and continue to work with, and I think it's been a great privilege for all of us to share in those endeavors. And then I know that there are members of the press as well here who we welcome. There are bios in the rear, so I'm not going to go into any great depth. I'm just going to indicate the individuals and their affiliation, and then through the first question we'll get more information about their roles and what they've been doing. So to my immediate left here is Thomas McDermott, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber Policy with the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. To his left is Evelyn Romele, Deputy Associate Administrator, Office of Policy Development and Analysis, the NTIA U.S. Department of Congress. To her left is Kevin Stein, the Chief of the Applied Cybersecurity Division, Information Technology Laboratory at NIST. And then to Kevin's left is my colleague Chris Boyer, who is the Assistant Vice President for Global Cybersecurity Policy, Public Policy with AT&T Services. And then at the end there is my colleague John Miller, who is Vice President of Global Policy and Law, Cybersecurity and Privacy for Information Technology Industry Council. And John is also my co-chair on the Multi-Association Framework Development Initiative, and he's also the vice chair of the IT Sector Coordinating Council. So thank you all for joining, and we will now get into the real substance here. So what I'd like to do is start by asking each of you to talk about your role, your organization's role over the past year in developing the, in taking on the initiatives that preceded the May 11th, 2017 executive order, the efforts subsequent to that, and what your organization is doing to tee up activities that are expected going forward. So with that, I'll turn to Tom and ask you to comment on that.
Sure. I feel like I could almost just say everything that Jeanette said, and just move on to Evelyn, but I will resist the urge to do that. So at the Department of Homeland Security, we had broad responsibilities and cyber policy issues before the President's executive order and then leading forward into implementation of the executive order. And I'll just maybe just very briefly hit on the major pieces of that, many of which Jeanette alluded to in her keynote. President Trump's executive order focused on sort of four big pieces: securing federal government networks and efforts to modernize federal IT. So DHS working very closely with Office of Management and Budget and the General Services Administration played a leading role in developing approaches to how we think about modernizing the federal IT. And as Jeanette said, that's not just about modernizing the cybersecurity tools, it's also thinking about how we're building IT, how we're leveraging cloud, shared services, and really truly building a modern information technology infrastructure for the federal government, which will enable security as a result. The second piece focused on critical infrastructure. Obviously, the comms and IT sector are a huge piece of our focus and efforts on critical infrastructure protection, but also looking more broadly across other critical infrastructure sectors. And I think if I had to characterize the sort of the driving policy initiative of the executive order with respect to critical infrastructure, it's about understanding consequences, so identifying what are the most critical parts and aspects and nodes of critical infrastructure. As Jeanette mentioned, thinking about where the systemic risks are and where the collateral consequences, and thinking less in terms of discrete owners and operators of systems, but more about how the systems fit together and where the real criticalities are across critical infrastructure. Undertook a number of efforts there, worked very closely with the Commerce Department, and maybe I'll leave Evelyn to talk a little bit more about the botnet report, which was one huge aspect of that effort under the executive order. Also working on international engagement, recognizing that none of the solutions to any of these problems are things that the United States can solve by itself. These are all truly global issues and global challenges. So working on identifying international engagement plans and thinking about how we can do more as a government, and working with other countries to try to change the calculus for those who seek to use ICT systems for malicious purposes, and move the needle towards holding people accountable and responsible for what we deem not acceptable behavior in cyberspace. Sorry. And the final piece, and I will not sort of have time to do it justice, is looking at cyber workforce. I know that's an issue that anyone that works in this space recognizes is a huge challenge. Government, industry, United States, global, anyone you talk to will say that is a huge issue. So that was the fourth big piece of the executive order. And again, DHS working very closely with the Commerce Department and trying to look at what some of the solutions are around cyber education, both for the federal government, but also more broadly for the nation.
Thanks, Robert. First of all, thank you very much for having me today, to USTelecom, Robert, Jonathan. We're very happy to be here. I am from the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, part of the Commerce Department, along with Kevin, my colleague from NIST. And let me just give you a little bit about NTIA, and then I'll get into some of the specifics of what we've been working on over the last 1 to 2 years. So NTIA is the President's advisor on information and telecommunications policy issues. And so with that very broad mandate, we do everything that you can think of in the ICT space. So, but in terms of cybersecurity, we do play that role in terms of advising our NSC and White House colleagues on issues impacting the communications marketplace and how security is impacting them. So really, the way that we fulfill our mission in this area is two ways. One, we're continually interacting with our interagency colleagues, with the rest of the federal government, on the very important national security and cybersecurity policy issues impacting them, impacting the nation, and the industry in this area. And two, we also do some very specific programs in this area to try to build on the cybersecurity mission. So what we have been doing recently, something that NTIA has a long history on, is something called the multi-stakeholder model for policymaking. And a few years back, we wanted to take a look at this model and see if it was something that might apply in the cybersecurity policy space too. It's a very useful way to develop policy when you find that there are parties that need to come to consensus on something, a way forward. There are very disparaging viewpoints on it. What we do at Commerce is to, in a non-regulatory way, help to bring parties together. We started using the model first to look at the issue of vulnerability disclosure early in 2015. And since that time, we've been evolving the use of the model for cybersecurity policy. We then moved into looking at the issue of patching for IoT devices. And we have a process that launched in 2016. Around that time, as you know, in early 2017, the White House was looking at its new agenda in the cybersecurity space. Our patching work, where we bring in stakeholders from civil society, industry, was generating a lot of interest for the direction that it was going. And so as the White House was building the executive order, they talked with NTIA about, is this open and transparent model that you're using to bring industry and others together to do policymaking? Is it something that we can also look at for other areas in the cybersecurity space? Long story short, it was one of the reasons why, in addition to NIST and DHS, our two partners on the botnet report aspect of the EO, NTIA was also a main player on that because of our relationships in building these types of processes with industry and civil society and bringing them together. So the last year has been, we are still moving forward in other areas of cybersecurity policy, but it's also been focused on working with all of you on this botnet report for the EO. We first launched a request for comment and got feedback from all of you. And then we moved into a workshop that NIST hosted as well to get additional feedback from the stakeholders involved in what should we do in this area. As many of you, I hope you know, we posted the draft report for that in December. And the next step is really, we have a request for comment out now, asking again all of you for feedback to say, did we get what we set out in this report? Did we get it right? Did we hear right from you? And so really for the next year, we'll be looking at refining that report and the path forward. We have some broad-based goals that we set out, but we really need to take it to the next step in terms of a roadmap in this area. And then we'll be also launching a phase 2 of our multi-stakeholder process as well that will be looking at software component transparency.
Excellent, Evelyn. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The sister brother agency, NIST, within Commerce.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. So thank you. It's nice to be here and see so many friendly faces, not just on the stage, but out there as well. So again, I'm Kevin Stein. I lead our Applied Cybersecurity Division at NIST. When I think of our mission, or maybe a better way to say it would be our purpose at NIST in the cybersecurity space, it is a very simple one in my mind. It's to help organizations understand and manage cybersecurity risk in the context of their missions. And we do that through kind of what I think is a kind of a three-legged stool in terms of our portfolio of foundational research, kind of, sending back to the early days of cryptography, for example, in the late 60s, early 70s, working with industry in those areas, all the way through to the second leg, which is one of applied engineering. How do we take these solutions, how do we take these standards-based approaches and tools and technologies that are available and integrate them in a way to produce solutions that can be used by industry, by government, by others to help address some of these cybersecurity challenges. And then the third leg of that stool is one of taking the outputs of the foundational research and the engineering side of things and actually transitioning that into the hands of the practitioners in a way that's going to be useful and practical and help to address some of those challenges. There's some cross-cuts to our work. I think I've mentioned some of those. There's the standards dimension, there's the technology, there's the measurement science. NIST is a kind of a measurement agency at heart, so that's something that we try to factor into everything. And I think the final one is really that technical expertise that's helping to drive some of these technology approaches, as well as informing meaningful policy activities as well. We do these this mesh of our purpose and these legs of the stool in a variety of different ways. Many of you collaborate with us in all of these areas, whether it be in cryptography, in vulnerability management, things like the National Vulnerability Database and security automation protocols and specifications to help with that information sharing and being able to deliver information and receive information and do something meaningful with it in our operational environments. Identity and access management, risk management to include things like the cybersecurity framework. I think many of you are very familiar with that. If nothing else, our work in supply chain risk management and privacy engineering under this, what I think of as a broader enterprise risk management bucket. Education and workforce development, Tom mentioned that, definitely a long-standing partnership with DHS, many other agencies, but very much with industry as well. Core internet and communications infrastructure, protocols and technologies, emerging technologies. Some of you may have seen kind of a blockchain primer, if you will, that we issued yesterday, opportunities and kind of demystifying those types of technologies as well. AI and machine learning as other examples. And then again, kind of the applied engineering side of bringing these things together and then helping to transition those into the hands of practitioners to help them understand, again, back to that purpose, understanding and managing cybersecurity risk in the context of their missions. I think between Tom and Evelyn, we've covered a lot of the different dimensions of the executive order over the last year. We certainly had a significant role. Unfortunately, my colleague Tim Polk couldn't be here today, but he one of the technical SMEs involved in the preparation of the botnet report, and I think many of you probably know Tim from many of the hats that he's worn over the many years in this space. Worked very closely with Tom and team at DHS on the cybersecurity education workforce development report that came out of was produced out of the executive order as well, through Rodney Peterson's leadership of the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education at NIST, and again in partnership with our colleagues at DHS and very much with many of you as well. I'd say the other piece where there was an intersection of a long-standing activity in the executive order was in the use of the cybersecurity framework for federal agencies now, and that's something that we've certainly been engaged with, not just with industry, including through USTelecom and many of you over the last several years, and that continues to this day. But how do we take the things that we've learned over the years with the framework and begin to kind of integrate those and apply those in a meaningful way in the context of federal operations? So kind of in a complementary way to the existing standards and practices that agencies have been using, and doing that in a helpful way. I think over the coming months and year, you'll continue to see obviously progress in the areas called out in the executive order and in other areas as well. We continue to ramp up on our IoT cybersecurity and privacy activities, and I can provide more details on that later. Cryptography, certainly in the area of quantum-resistant encryption, something that many of you may be interested in, very active there. And then certainly in the area of the cybersecurity framework and broader enterprise risk management activities. And as I'm sure you're all aware, at some point in the spring, we'll issue a final version, 1.1, of the cybersecurity framework. I know you're all chomping at the bit to review that and begin to use it in a meaningful way.
I think we've already reviewed it and had some real success in making some important enhancements, so thank you.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah, with that, I'm going to turn it to my colleague, Chris Boyer, who's not only here in his role as with AT&T, but Chris had a leadership role in the production of the NSTAC report this year, which fed into the botnet initiative. So, Chris, if you could talk maybe a little bit about your activities in that regard.
Yeah, sure. Well, before I start, I think this event was entitled State of the Union around cybersecurity, so I just wanted to start off by commenting that I think the state of the partnership, which is what we're really talking about here today, is very strong. I think we have a really good relationship with DHS and with NIST and NTIA, and I just want to comment that I really appreciate the efforts the government's making to move cybersecurity forward. AT&T participates in a lot of these initiatives. We work with DHS through their various information sharing programs, whether it's the AIS portal or the CISP program. We have folks that are embedded with DHS as part of the NCC process and the NCIC, so very strong relationship, and I think the partnership's going very well overall. In terms of the NSTAC report, so yes, AT&T was one of the co-leads on the NSTAC report last year on botnets. That report was finalized this past November. It really focuses on, as Jonathan pointed out at the introduction here, it was a call to action for everybody in the ecosystem to step up their game on security. So if you look at a lot of the different ecosystem partners, whether it's communications companies, whether it's software developers, whether it's enterprise businesses, consumers, across the board, up and down the spectrum, there's a need for more of a focus and more to be done on security. So I think speaking for the comms industry, I think we acknowledge that we have a role to play. There's certain things that we can do to improve the situation on security, and the report kind of walks through some of those measures. But there's only so much that can be done by focusing on comms. There's roles for other industry ecosystem players to do as well. And I was encouraged that the NTIA report, I think, also generally acknowledges that as an issue. And I think, so really what we were trying to do in the NSTAC report, which feeds into what NTIA is doing, is really raise the bar for everybody across the board and see if we can move the needle on security. That said, a lot of the steps that we put in that report I would view as more incremental things that they're not game changers, right? These are things that in a lot of cases that we know should be done. They're existing standards, and we're looking at ways in which we can raise the bar and get them more widely adopted and used. But there still is a fundamental underlying problem that needs to be addressed, and that's what the cybersecurity moonshot, I think that Jonathan mentioned earlier, that is what the moonshot was really getting at. It's like while we try to implement these different practices that kind of make incremental improvements to improve our security posture, there's a longer term, bigger picture issue of how do we make more fundamental changes that will address these issues in the long run, and that, in my mind, that's really what the Moonshot Project is trying to get at.
Thank you. As I introduce John Miller, I want to say that you heard our CEO talk about the increasing convergence in industry across ICT and some of the common interests, a lot of the common interests we have in cybersecurity. I'll say that in July when I read the comments from John's organization in response to the NIST request for comments after the executive order, I called John and I said, John, thank you very much. Great job for ITI. And by the way, I would have been willing to sign everything on those comments. So with that, John, I'll turn it to you, and you can talk about your association, your efforts, and what you're trying to promote over the course of the last year and going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, for the compliment, and also thanks to you, to Jonathan, to USTelecom for inviting me to this great event, and thanks also to our government and other industry colleagues on the panel, and to all of you. I think when kind of to preface the ITI priorities, I think it makes sense to spend 30 seconds describing a little more about who ITI is. We are, in many ways, a counterpart to USTelecom. We are a Washington, D.C. based trade association representing the tech sector. One of the things that I think is very important to understand about our membership is, we have over 60 leading technology companies, really from all across the IT sector. So you have enterprise and consumer companies, but you have hardware and software companies. You you have internet services and cybersecurity services companies, and a variety of other innovative companies. You have about a third of those companies that are headquartered outside the U.S., but all the companies are doing business globally, and I think that really informs a lot of our work, and I think thematically that's something that certainly came through in for instance, the botnet report that we've been talking about here today. In terms of the ITI priorities prior to the executive order coming out, I can tell you that really for a number of years now, and I think they date back to 2011, ITI had put out some global cybersecurity policy principles back in 2011 that really focused on a lot of topics that probably by now seem obvious to many in this room. I mean, things like focusing on risk management-based solutions, the importance of prioritizing information sharing, importance of the public-private partnership that we've been talking about today, the importance of international standards and furthering global solutions. I think a lot of those principles are evinced in the cybersecurity framework that Kevin was talking about, and I think they're all really important if we're going to make progress on the botnet report and some of the other work streams that were kicked off by the executive order. I can also tell you that we're almost ready to release an updated version of those principles that certainly are updated to reflect things like IoT security risks and botnets and other items. But the core principles really don't diverge that much. In terms of, and the one other thing that's really important, as well as working here in Washington with the U.S. government and our partners here, we advocate in capitals all around the world on behalf of our companies, and we advocate these very same principles, obviously with varying degrees of success, but we're in China, we're in the EU, we're in Brazil, and we're in India, and in all these major markets, there's a lot of cybersecurity policy activity that everyone may or may not be aware of, but it's really something that's very important as we consider what types of solutions going forward. The global ICT industry and governments working together are going to be able to support. A couple of things just to mention specifically about the EO and some of the work streams and some of the work we did. I mean, certainly along with USTelecom and others, we tried to drive consensus amongst our diverse membership on what types of recommendations we really wanted to advance and suggest to NTIA in the context of botnets. Robert was kind enough to point out that, hey, the global telecom industry actually shares a lot in common, and there really is a lot of common ground on cybersecurity in particular, where the comms and IT sectors and others in industry can work together. We certainly also continue to be very involved in the cybersecurity framework, and Robert mentioned the multi-association framework development initiative that I'm pleased to co-lead with Robert. One of the things that I know we really talked about a lot this year in that initiative was the importance of trying to further, maybe not the framework itself, but certainly the framework approach, risk management, international standards-based, developed through partnership, to further that approach globally in many other markets. Because again, if we look out on the horizon, you have many kind of very prescriptive top-down types of recommendations out there. And then finally, I think it's worth mentioning, there were a bunch of other work streams kicked off by the executive order. Some were formal multi-stakeholder processes like that run by NTIA. There was a whole host of other processes that were kicked off maybe more informally, such as the market transparency piece of the executive order. And I know really all of these agencies represented up here all really served as conveners in bringing industry and other stakeholders in to try to solicit our feedback, because I think there, as Chris mentioned, there's a recognition that we really need to do this together if we're going to be effective. And so while nothing changed in the big picture post-executive order, I think it just reiterated the importance of working together on all these topics. Thanks, Robert.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm not going to get through my list of 32 questions, but I will get through some of the priority things that I want to come out of here with. I'm going to turn to Evelyn for a moment, and I'll say, and I note that this was mentioned as a recommendation in the NSTAC report also. If we were here 3 years ago and you were listening to industry, you would hear us say, we think there's just a lack of rationalization across the government landscape in terms of some of the activities. We don't understand why we're doing supply chain at the FCC and the DoD and throughout the government ecosystem. We didn't have the resources to support that. We didn't think that the government had the resources to support that. And I know you in particular, I think, have played a very important role through the interagency conversations to reach consensus and to think very carefully about how the breadth of these activities that are outlined in the report are going to be implemented. So I'll start with you, Evelyn. Can you talk a little bit about how much effort and ongoing dialogue occurs across the government to ensure that we are being as efficient as we can be with industry and government resources?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Robert. I'm so glad you asked this question because I really think the process that we went through for the botnet report is such a good example of the goodness that can come when the government players do work so closely together, do coordinate so closely together, and with industry and civil society as well. And I think this process that we used for this was such a good example. And really, one question that Robert sort of teed up for us behind the scenes was, give a little bit about what role you've played. And I sort of laughed to myself that NTIA, I thought, there's no title for chief, glue maker, but that in some cases that's really, I think, the role that we did play. From the outset with this open and transparent process, since we do this, since we work with you all so closely on doing policy development, we have a process that we used, and we wanted to launch that RFC right away to get feedback from you all in the direction that we should go in. And then following that with our experts over at NIST, who really have the ability then to take that to the next level, to dig deeper with you all, but at the entire step of the way, including DHS and the NSTAC players who were working on their piece, and making sure that we were just continuing to track and involve each expertise piece that everyone had. And I really think, Chris mentioned that he really believes that the partnership is strong. I think that the process, this example that we used, and in addition, these are the three main government players that were involved in the botnet report. But we also worked so closely to integrate the rest of the interagency players in the report as well. And I think what we came out with in January is really a reflection of the entire community being behind this and saying, yes, I see, where my voice was in that. And now we're coming back again to say, did we get this right? Now let's really start to get serious about implementation. Can we do this? What comes first? What do we prioritize? What's the low-hanging fruit? And so again, I think there's a lot of vision and recognition, and with the deconfliction and really the commitment to working together, that there's a realization that this is a nice model for going forward.
Would anybody else like to comment on that particular point?
Briefly, I think everyone talks a lot about the process that we use for some of the EO deliverables and the botnet report. But I think more broadly, I think as the government across the board has come to realize and accept the fact that cybersecurity is sort of far too complicated a problem for any one agency or entity to try to solve itself. So I think for a while we were struggling with a little bit of sort of typical bureaucratic kind of turfiness, like this was my problem to solve as an agency. And I think we've all come to realize that none of us can solve it ourselves. So I think actually across the board, and we're not perfect, right? So I would not give us if I were grading us, Robert, I would not give us an A on this, but I think it is a strong B with a trend line in the right direction in terms of coordinating our activity, not just on the policymaking side, but also on the operational side. So I think, for example, DHS is working, I think, much more closely and much more seamlessly with FBI in terms of responding to incidents than was ever the case before. So I think across the board, we've come to accept the fact that this is a complicated problem and that we need to do it together. And maybe this is one upside of sort of a budget-constrained universe, right? None of us, frankly, have the resources to do it ourselves, so that we have to kind of lean on each other.
Great.
I'll just say very quickly from my perspective, it is definitely trending in the right direction. I mean, as you said, 3 years ago, you would have heard a lot of concern on the industry side, I think, of duplication of efforts, multiple agencies looking at the same topics, over and over, and it's splintering everyone to try to deal with all the different efforts. And that's kind of, I think, as Tom pointed out, it's kind of the nature of the beast a little bit, because cyber affects all the different agencies, but there's definitely seems to be a greater degree of collaboration going on between the agencies now, and it's definitely trending the right way.
Great. I'm going to pivot a little bit now with a little hint of advocacy, and maybe some folks will pick it up. But we talked about the global, the international aspects, the large organizations that you were referring to, John, obviously AT&T with a global footprint. But there's another big community of businesses in the U.S. and globally, and it's reflected clearly in our association. In fact, many of the CEOs of these smaller companies are here today. I'm concerned that we as a nation have to recognize very explicitly that there are different expectations for global companies that have the economic resources and business plans that allow them to recover for costs in cybersecurity versus organizations that may have regional footprints, serving more locally communities, and I think this applies to parts of your membership as well. So I would ask the government folks, how are you integrating the notion that many of these small businesses really don't have the technical resources or the financial resources necessary when you talk about implementing the kinds of tools you discuss in the report, the ingress filtering and the best common practices and the technologies deployed to support that? How do we reconcile that? Are we making progress with incentives? I know it came up in 2013, but we have to be careful that we don't burden these organizations with unrealistic expectations, I think. And I think we need government's help in managing that consideration. So I'll turn it to the government folks to start.
So I'll take a stab at that, and certainly others will have thoughts as well. I mean, look, in the report, it talks about this being an ecosystem problem or ecosystem challenge. And look, small businesses are part of that ecosystem. They're producers, they're also consumers, and they in some cases face resource constraints. Maybe that's not just limited to small businesses. I think many organizations do as well. But I think as we learned from the framework effort, and we heard very clearly from industry, small businesses also sometimes have the ability to be a little bit more flexible and agile in their innovative approaches that they put in place, maybe because of the resource constraint issues. This is the type of feedback that we definitely want to receive from the community, not just on the botnet report. I think that's front and center with everybody right now because it's out there, but certainly in any type of government effort or initiative or report, what type of feedback can you provide us on making the types of things that we put out or the recommendations that we may be offering up to make them more practical and usable for organizations of all sizes, not just the big multinational players, but the small businesses that are equally, if not have a greater impact on the broader ecosystem. I think some of the things that we think about in this is how do we get kind of these common practices that are understood by many and maybe more frequently adopted and implemented, if you will, by more advanced organizations or more well-resourced organizations. How do we provide those in a more digestible, kind of practical way to help organizations of all sizes take those and apply them in a meaningful way in the context of their environments? Some of the things related to the cybersecurity framework, certainly a big focus on profiles in framework language to help small businesses understand and kind of prioritize some of those activities that may be beneficial to them. Certainly, small business is a key part of our activities at the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, where we kind of bring in these standards-based technologies and approaches and try to put out example solutions or blueprints, if you will, that can help organizations, not just the large organizations, but the smalls, the franchisee owners or whatever the case may be, to be able to adopt or take advantage of the technologies and the capabilities of the technologies they already have in their infrastructures as well. And then being able to have that communication with the smalls, with their business partners, their suppliers, the other organizations, and the key role that they play in the supply chain of other organizations as well.
So just two things to add to what Kevin provided. Just definitely at NTIA with the multi-stakeholder process that I talked about, we do, one thing we try to do is to bring the small players into those discussions. We've made that a commitment from day one. For the patching work, we in particular reached out to some of the smaller manufacturing communities to try to bring them to the table. We really found that because there are so many small players, security is new to them, they weren't even thinking about it. So definitely on the government side, it's taken a little extra push, but we are committed to bringing them to the table. You'll find that what NTIA does with the multi-stakeholder process is, because we're looking to build some consensus around best practices, sometimes they won't be very deep. Like for the communication side for patching, that group came up with 3 main guidelines. Just tell consumers if you're going to patch, tell them how long, if you are doing it, how long you're going to do it, and tell them how they can receive it. Just 3 basic things. So we try to do it at that level where it's something that both big and smalls would be able to do right away, and then the work can maybe lead to additional standardization activity when you need to go to that further depth. But the second thing I'll just add is that one thing that we think about too is just how, so the impact on small SMEs is that there is innovation happening in this area, that platforms are being developed. There is a realization that this is also a market opportunity, right? Not every small provider is going to be able to do everything. And we want a competitive marketplace, so how can we use platforms, other innovation, to be able to get the services and affordable services to these other players in the market? And just working with some of these smaller players in our multi-stakeholder processes, there is still there's adoption, awareness, education that needs to occur, and we're trying to work on that. But it is nice to see that there is innovation happening around security that the smalls should be able to take advantage of while we're all sort of catching up in this new IoT world and other advancements.
Yeah.
I saw Chris, your hand.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I should answer this question since I'm with AT&T, so I don't really qualify as a small business, but I guess I'll put on my hat as from the Sector Coordinating Council side. We've done a lot of work with the small businesses that are communications companies as part of the Sector Coordinating Council, and I generally agree with Robert that there needs to be different expectations for the big players and for the smaller players. That's very clear to me. That said, we're all interconnected at some level, so it's kind of a catch-22. While the expectations can't be the same, we're interconnected, so there's definitely a need to have at least some level of security controls in place across the board. And most of the small carrier community that I've dealt with in the Sector Coordinating Council side have been very receptive to that. I've not seen a lot of resistance. I know Jeff's here in the crowd, and there's other people here that, his company SilverStar has done a lot of work in that space, so I feel like our industry does acknowledge that. One of the ways we tried to split the difference in the INSTAC report was basically by saying that, if there are basic standards or, best practices that we think should be implemented, and small businesses can't do it for whatever reason, we need to go back and work with DHS and other agencies to investigate why is that, and see what are the tools that policymakers have in their pocket that could help make that more viable for them. And that does go to the incentives questions and other issues that come into play there. But I think there should be an acknowledgement that there's different tiers. And a great example of this, I was just seeing this a couple days ago in an email exchange, that when we have briefings on classified security incidents, right? A lot of small companies don't have classified cleared personnel, right? So larger carriers do, and they can go invest in going through that entire process and getting people cleared and doing those types of things. So there's always going to be a delta between the big players and the smaller players, and I think we should acknowledge that and make sure, but also make sure that we're trying to drive at least some baseline level of standards in place, and how do we help those companies do that? I think that should be the discussion we're having now.
Honestly,
Yeah, and just to add on to some of these, some of the previous comments, one of the other real challenges from a really, particularly if you're trying to factor in small and medium-sized entities, is when you look at some of the kind of the trajectory of some of the policy-making work, both in the U.S. and globally. There's a lot of potential discussion around, certainly measurement and metrics and baseline standards and certifications, assessments, testing, labeling perhaps, particularly in the IoT space. And these are all very valid topics, but there's a real danger in having kind of this regulatory fragmentation, not only across different countries, but even if you look at the IoT and the fact that it, by definition connects all the different sectors together, having different regulatory approaches or even different regulatory approaches at the state level in the U.S., which we've seen in the banking sector in New York, for instance, is really potentially problematic, in the sense that it's hard enough for a large company like AT&T or some of the other large IT companies to figure out how to address, multiple sets of standards. Frankly, it's not really a scalable solution, and that's why it's impossible for a small company to do that, right? And it might seem counterintuitive, but that's why it's actually so important that we continue to all work collectively to advance international standards. Now, on the one hand, small, medium-sized businesses also don't have the resources to go head over to ISO or ITU meetings and whatnot, but larger companies do, and the U.S. government does resource standards development activities, and I think one of the things that we were talking about on our prep call is kind of the need for almost a more integrated national strategy to advance international standards for cybersecurity, because the reality is a lot of other governments are pouring more resources into this activity, and if we end up with standards that frankly our companies don't like, or that are just too onerous to apply, it's going to really potentially break the interoperability that we all rely on to make the internet be the internet. Really.
I'm going to use that as a segue, and then I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask some questions. And I'm going to start with you, Tom, if you don't mind. So the report, the January 5th report, makes it clear that there's a need for this international collaboration, whether it's on information sharing, on standards development, best practices. What from a practical perspective in the fairly short term, what kinds of initiatives can we contemplate here to make some real progress? I know you talk about the work that's been done with Japan. Some of it has been bilateral. It's been good work done with the Brits, I think some of the other like-minded countries. But if we did everything right in the United States, the problem doesn't go away. So we need to get, I think, a more functional level of collaboration and engagement internationally. So I'm going to, Tom, tell me what you think about how we accomplish that. Can we make some real progress quicker than perhaps we've been doing in the last year or two? Because it's clearly in the report as a foundational concept.
Yeah, so I don't think there's a quick solution to the international standards development. So I think I don't think the solutions are going to be quick to come by. But I think we can quickly make progress in getting sort of heading in the direction that we need to go. And I think I think this is an area where, frankly, probably the government and industry both have to find a way to sort of step up and figure out how to resource these international standards development efforts. And given that we both are operating in a sort of universe of limited resources, how can we do it smartly? And how can the government and industry sort of jointly identify and prioritize, which are the international standards efforts that are most important? And how can we sort of jointly think about getting the right subject matter experts to the right forums to sort of drive in the direction? And I think, again, we're not we were going to grade, but decided not to sort of grade ourselves. I think if I were to grade our efforts here, it would be a little bit less than our grade in terms of interagency collaboration, just because I think that we've had conversations within the government and with industry about the need to do this, and I would say we've had similar conversations with some of our closest international partners about the need to sort of do this among countries that sort of have similar approaches to the internet and the way that we want to see the internet continue to evolve. And I think that we all recognize the issue, and I think now we have to figure out how we can execute it and execute it in a joint way. And I think probably in a way that involves both of us, government and industry, finding ways to find the resources to do it.
The urgency here, I think, is that, in a meeting that John and I attended last week when we heard what was going on in Europe and in other areas, that if the United States doesn't take leadership here and set kind of the foundational principles for this, we'll be on the back end of something that probably looks a lot more onerous, and we're going to need to work closely with government to effectuate those conversations soon. And Kevin, you've been doing a lot of traveling around the world, and I know having good conversations about the framework. So
yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the framework in some ways has been a kind of an on-ramp, if you will, to cyber dialogue around national strategies, coming from other nations as well. I mean, and we've seen great success and continued success in this area when you have a number of nations taking the framework and translating it for their own use and even enhancing it in some ways. In the case of Japan and Israel, for example. In other nations, you have Italy that's taken the framework and essentially made that the foundation of their national cybersecurity strategy. And I think to John's earlier point, which is exactly right. I mean, sometimes other nations may not appeal to them to take something that was primarily developed within the U.S. and make that the basis of their strategy. But the principles of the framework are things that kind of transcend the national borders, if you will. So voluntary, open, consensus-based, standards-based approaches appeal to many nations, and we're seeing increasing use of those types of words that just so happen to be anchored in the 5 functions in the framework of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. There's a lot of power there when we're all beginning to speak the same language and using approaches or accepting approaches that are based on those core tenets. And we are also seeing activities in international standards bodies where they're beginning to, in fact, right now in ISO, for example, producing technical reports that are looking at ways to bring many of those core tenets and concepts and even some of the words out of the cybersecurity framework into standards bodies. To the broader question of kind of standards engagement, and it definitely is an opportunity and a need, quite honestly, for industry and government to be on the same page and identify where are those gap areas that are most important in an international standard space, and then how do we collectively begin to play make more strategic decisions about how to play there. Using IoT as a very specific example, I think soon, within the next hopefully a couple of weeks, there'll be an interagency report, and certainly developed with interagency partners. It'll come out as a NIST document, but that's okay. That talks about the state of kind of cybersecurity standards in the context of IoT. And when you look at the landscape of standards with respect to cybersecurity and IoT, this will provide it'll be a good tool to help understand, where are there, many standards activities and kind of the degree of maturity, if you will, of those, and many of you may be playing in those areas now. But I think the piece that will help us to be more strategic about our engagements collectively is where are the gaps in those areas, and how do we identify, prioritize those gaps, and then begin to resource those in terms of participation in these standards bodies, leadership in editor roles and things like that in these standards bodies as well. So I think there's certainly an opportunity, and we look forward to your feedback there too.
Great.
Can I say one
Yes.
one really quick thing on one of the other, not to harp on the NSTAC report, but one of the main recommendations in that report was on standards and the need for a collaborative standard strategy between the government and the private sector. And I was really encouraged by Tom's comment that really hits it on the mark. That right now, if you go to I've spent a lot of time going to ITU meetings and traveling and in some of those environments, and in a lot of cases, the U.S. is outnumbered by other countries in those bodies, and there needs to be a strategy around ensuring that we get the right resources there from both the government and the private sector. And I think sitting down and kind of hashing out what are the venues in which we need to have people there, how do we get the right resources and experts in those venues, to advance our interest, I think is something that absolutely needs to be done. And it doesn't have to be just the U.S. because it really is kind of with our allies and other countries. I think they obviously can provide some of that resources too. So kind of pulling those pieces together and developing that concerted strategy there is something I think would be absolutely necessary.
Great. Let's open it up for a couple of questions before we close. I see any questions from the audience? Okay, this gentleman over here. I think maybe if you can get the mic, that'd be helpful. Thank you. And if you can announce who you are and your affiliation.
Thank you. And my name is Sunny Sinha. I'm a consultant. I work with some of the best cyber technologies in the world, mostly in the startup space, but some in the telecom industry. And first off, thank you very much for putting together a fantastic panel, and you're taking on a very, very hard job in looking at the issue of cyber holistically. My question is actually more for Dan Stein. You mentioned something about some of the research that you're doing with quantum and a couple of other technologies. How do you go about considering what's commercializable and actually usable on scale? So, for instance, I'm also working with a homomorphic encryption company that's been doing a lot in terms of being easily implementable when it comes to standards encrypting technology. But I know quantum is very important, but it's probably about 5-10 years away, right? How do you prioritize need based on priority, I think is what I'm asking.
Yeah, so in the case of cryptographic technologies, and specifically in the context of quantum-resistant crypto, it's something that we're devoting a lot of attention to, and it's certainly not just NIST, other agencies are as well, and certainly industry also. From our perspective, we like we have with past cryptographic efforts, AES, the different hash algorithms as well. Again, running a very open and transparent process, tapping into the expertise. While we have deep technical expertise in this, we want to tap into the technical expertise and the experiences of other organizations and experts around the world as well, because this is a complex challenge. I think in the case of quantum-resistant encryption, for example, we're in the midst of a public process. We recently solicited and received several dozen, if you will, candidate algorithms in response to that. We're going through the review process now, and those are things that we will then put back out for broader community review in an attempt to continue to winnow that down into potentially candidate quantum-resistant algorithms over the next several years. That's not something that happens overnight. I think in terms of kind of prioritizing and the usability and kind of the transition of these things into practice, these things take time as well. And it's something that we want to engage the community, get the feedback on, okay, here are the strong properties, if you will, or the attributes that we look for when we're developing or soliciting the development of these types of algorithms, but how do we then transition those things into practice? It's something that takes time, and like everything in this space, constant dialogue and coordination.
I think we have time for one more question. Anybody, or have we answered every conceivable question? Okay, great. Gentleman back there.
Hi, Derek Johnson. I'm with FCW. I wanted to ask about how you go about regulating the IoT market. I think we've all seen that report from Gartner about there's going to be something like 20 billion IoT devices in play and connected to the internet by 2020. You've seen a couple of members of Congress put forth legislation that kind of attempts to take a first crack at regulating this market, but one of the areas of disagreement that they've come up on is how do you create a set of universal standards for not only your smart fridges and some of the more sophisticated devices that you're looking at, but also that would apply to some of those cheaper kind of bargain basement IoT items that you can find at Walmart. How do you all see that gap being bridged? Do you think it's possible to effectively regulate the IoT market, and what needs to happen from both industry and government to get to that place where you can?
Can I ask? I was going to ask John to start.
Sure. I think you're right to point out some of the challenges there. I think from our perspective, number one, it's an absolutely legitimate concern, obviously, right? The IoT security, and I think Evelyn was mentioning the multi-stakeholder process that NTIA ran to really try to focus on some real basic types of things that they could perhaps help address, such as whether a device is upgradable or patchable or something. That's of course not a problem with an iPhone, but maybe just some new connected baby monitor or something suddenly has no compute capacity to even, be upgradable or patchable, and that is a real problem. I think the problem with some of the policy approaches that we've seen thus far is that there, with few exceptions, there's not much of a rational effort to adequately scope what the legislation is or the regulatory approaches are addressed to. Specifically, like if you want to address IoT security, you can't define what you're trying to regulate as everything that can plug into the internet, which would include everything from major industrial control systems to the to iPhones to connected automobiles to critical infrastructure systems, and frankly, a lot of the legislation just kind of has that type of broad scope, and that's something that needs to be right-sized before we can really rationally address the issue, I think.
We're closing up, but you want to,
Yeah, so NTIA actually wrote a green paper on IoT, and we published that in January last year. And now that we have a new assistant secretary, we'll be circling back. We also put that out for comment back in January. And so we'll be taking next steps on that. But really the conclusion that we heard, and we received a lot of support from stakeholders on this, is that this IoT is an emerging market. It's emerging tech. Let's find ways that we can allow the innovation to keep advancing. The technology is moving fast. There's no silver bullet approach. Luckily, being at Commerce and NTIA, I'm not a regulatory agency, so I don't automatically go to that as a solution. But really, what our role is too within the government is to say, how can we make progress on these public policy issues that come along with the innovation without holding back that progress? The multi-stakeholder process is one way that we try to do that. We bring the parties together who actually have to implement these things in the marketplace. They have to compete in the marketplace. How can we come together on those best practices to try to make progress without holding back the realization of where this market might be going? We've had great progress in having many of the interagency players that are looking at these issues in the health market, in the finance market, other places, come in and talk with us about what we're learning from the industry members who are coming in and participating in the process. Many of them are participating in the process because they want to see, they recognize the advancement. Yes, the stakes are high on the security side as we're moving into this IoT space. Where there are more physical effects when things go wrong. But you also see this commitment of the collaboration in terms of how we can make progress on addressing those issues, but to do it in a way where we're not holding back the innovation that's occurring. So,
thank you very much. I think we're going to have to stay within our schedule. Maybe you can join me in thanking our panel for participating. So thank you all for taking a good part of your day to join us. As Jonathan said, stay tuned for some information that we will be sharing shortly about further collaboration with ICT, and we'll look forward to the 11th Cyber Policy Forum not too far down the road. Thank you.